Hello and welcome back to the Contrarians. We have a Patreon suggested topic today, and we have a fun panel here of Bicyclelegs and Bill, who are going to talk about Joe Jackson. So if you like the Contrarians, if you like talking about heavy metal and rock music, and sometimes some not so heavy stuff as well, like and subscribe, and please share if you have friends who you think would like to be in on the conversation as well. And also there is always a second conversation in the comments, so please let us know what you think about Joe Jackson. We want to hear it. There is also a TeePublic, a Patreon, and a Ko-fi. Links for all those in the description if you're interested in sharing support that way. So what we're going to do is we're going to go around and get a general sort of overview, thesis statement, whatever you want to call it, from both of our panelists, and then we'll open it up to a few questions from me. I personally not a Joe Jackson fan, not that I don't like his music, just haven't really listened to much of it. So I have a few questions because after listening to a little bit today for some research, I feel like I missed out. So I have some things I need to know. Anyways. For those of you who are like me and don't know, Joe Jackson is an English musician and singer-songwriter. He has had a fairly popular hit that you might have heard of called Steppin' Out, and he's often associated with the 1980s second British invasion of the US. He's recorded 20 studio albums and received 5 Grammy Award nominations. So without any further ado, I'm going to throw it over to Bill first. Bill, why don't you let us know about Joe Jackson?
All right. Thank you, Nick. Joe has actually been around for much longer than his recording career. He was classically trained in his younger days, and then he was a hired hand, essentially, playing in various bands throughout the 70s. It wasn't until 1979 that his first album was released. And at that time, he was associated with Graham Parker and Elvis Costello, all the angry young men of the British New Wave boom. But much like Elvis Costello, as we'll find out, he's moved beyond that over the years and branched out quite a bit. Those early days, it was essentially the Joe Jackson Band with Graham Mabey and Dave Houghton and Gary Sanford as his bandmates throughout the first 3 albums, which came out in 79 and 80. And there was little variation in sound regarding those early albums. Some people still think those are his best. I definitely disagree with that. I go back to Neil Peart's quote regarding early Rush albums, saying they were like childhood sketches, basically. I tend to think of Joe's early albums like that also, even though they remain among his most popular. I think he's gotten much deeper and more interesting over the years. Before he had his biggest hit in 1982, he took one of his first major detours. That was Joe Jackson's Jumpin' Jive in 1981. And at this point, he took a bunch of old songs, particularly by Louis Jordan, from the 40s and 50s, basically a bunch of old jump and swing and blues type songs, and recorded really good, entertaining versions of them. Stuff like Is You Is and Is You Ain't My Baby and Five Guys Named Mo. Stuff that people much earlier than my generation would definitely recognize. And at that point, the critics probably thought he had lost his mind because he was taking what looked like a promising mainstream pop career and taking a wild left turn, which he has done many times, which is one of the reasons I love it. And after that, just when people thought he'd gone off the deep end, in 1982, he put out his most successful album, Night and Day, which, as Nick said, that is where Steppin' Out came from, his biggest hit. And that's where I jumped on board originally. I was 14 at the time, and I fell in love with that song and that album, and I've been here ever since. But again, that's not one of my favorite albums. It's a really good album. It's a classic, but I think he started getting better the next time out. As the 80s continued, he had some more minor hits, stuff like You Can't Always, or you can't get what you want until you know what you want, 1984. And then in between, he threw out a couple more left turns, a couple movie soundtracks, Mike's Murder and Tucker, the Man in His Dream. And those were mostly instrumental. And he also put out an instrumental album called Willpower. When I got my copy of Willpower, on this one, like you probably can't see it here, it says under Willpower, the instrumental album. At that time, when I bought the cassette version, it did not say that. And I was a little disgruntled when I got it home and found this odd semi-classical instrumental piece from this guy that had been writing all these great pop songs for the last number of years. It's definitely grown on me over the years. I think it's a wonderful album now, but I was a little put out at the time, as were many fans, and as they would continue to be throughout his career. Essentially, at that point, you get into the late 80s, and his commercial star would start to fall quite a bit. Hello, Bicycle Legs.
Hi, I'm on my phone at the moment. I'm trying to log in on the computer, but it's having to update, so I might be a few minutes. Just quickly popping in to let you know. Hopefully I'll be back soon.
Okay. At that point, he put out an album called Laughter and Lust in 1991, which was essentially, for a good decade, the last gasp of his more mainstream, accessible, catchy pop rock type albums. And then he immediately took another curve into Night Music in 1993, which is another semi-classical. At this point, he was getting ready to get on the Sony classical label, and many people accused him of being pretentious, and they wanted him to go back and write some more stuff like his early days, like Look Sharp and Night and Day. But Joe being Joe, he followed his muse instead, and well, as a fan, I'm glad he continued to do so. He followed that up with Heaven and Hell, which is another odd semi-classical concept album regarding 7 deadly sins, featuring guests like Jane Siberry, Brad Roberts from the Crash Test Dummies, Suzanne Vega, and assorted other semi-well-known musicians of the 90s. And again, that went over pretty well like a lead balloon, and with everybody but hardcore fans. And even amongst some of the hardcore fans, they were completely wondering, has Joe lost it? Is he ever going to give us what we want? He was giving me what I wanted, but I didn't necessarily know it at the time. Next, he went full bore into the Sony classical era with Symphony 1, which is what it says. But true to his form, he has a number of jazz musicians, and he has Steve Vai playing guitar on this album, which is the first time that Steve Vai would guest on one of Joe's albums. It's good. I like it, but despite his classical training, I don't think any of the serious modern classical composers have anything to worry about. Next, in 2000, he put out Night and Day 2, which was intended as a sequel to his biggest hit. The original Night and Day had been essentially a tribute to New York City and to Cole Porter and his songwriting. And frankly, I think the sequel's better. I think he really captured New York City itself much better than he did originally. He's improved greatly as a lyricist. So I have no doubt I'm in the minority there, considering the original is his most popular album. But yeah, you could accuse him of possibly going back to the well and pandering by calling an album Night and Day 2, but he did follow through with the concept and did it quite well. It didn't strike me as a money grab at all. He could also be accused of the same thing on his follow-up album in 2003, which is Joe Jackson Band Volume 4, wherein he reunited with his original band from the first 3 albums. But again, I'm in the minority probably here because I find this the best of the 4 albums with that band. Again, he's much more mature as a songwriter and as a general composer and musician. The band has a lot more experience. I think it's great. I'd trade in all three of those originals just to keep this one. After that, he tortured us for 5 years. That's how long it took to put out Rain, in which he dropped guitarist Gary Sanford, kept bassist Graham Mabey, and drummer Dave Houghton, and they went out as essentially a piano, bass, drums, jazz trio playing pop songs. And that's pretty much what this album consists of, but true to his style, they're excellent, catchy, intelligent pop songs, well played, and a lot of the musicianship wouldn't be out of place in, say, like stuff like the In Crowd and semi-popular early 60s mainstream jazz type stuff. After that, the wait became even worse in a sense. It only took 4 years to put out The Duke, but it was not an album of original material. It was an album of unconventional Duke Ellington covers. And again, Steve Vai, he had an unconventional album, so why not bring a famous rock guitarist to play on this jazz tribute album, just like we did in our symphony album? Now, Steve fits right in with Joe because they're both weirdos that do whatever they want when they want. So this one also ticked me off a bit at the time, but in the long run, it made me become a huge Duke Ellington fan. And now I greatly appreciate this album more now that I've gone back and discovered the originals and I see what he did with them. And he had top tier modern jazz players on here, like, let me see here. We have Christian McBride, we have Regina Carter, and we had the odd guest appearance by Iggy Pop on vocals on one track. So, and the late Sharon Jones from Sharon Jones and the Dap Kings did a vocal. So it's a fun album. I quite enjoy it. I wouldn't put it among his best. But so at that point, it had been 4 years since his last original album. We got to wait almost 8 from Rain until finally in 2015, Fast Forward came out. At least we got our money's worth because this is his longest album. There are 16 songs here. The concept, which is kind of cool and interesting, is he was making a tribute to 4 different cities. It's basically 4 EPs building into an album. The first one was a tribute to New York, followed by Amsterdam, Berlin, and New Orleans. And the cool thing is that each EP on this album had an entirely different band, pretty much mostly made up of people from the city that it was making a tribute to. So that was pretty cool. To date, 2019's Fool is his most recent album. And true to my history with Joe Jackson, this one is still growing on me. I'm almost always initially disappointed or have kind of a, it's okay, it's good, typical stuff reaction. And it's only a few years down the line that I really go, wow, I see what he was doing there. I'm really grasping it now. So maybe I'm just shallow, or maybe Joe's a lot deeper than people give him credit for, or maybe it's somewhere in between. But the guy definitely has the ability to reach me. This particular shirt, believe it or not, I've been such a hardcore Joe fan at all. This came from the only time I've ever been able to see him live. And that was prior to that last album, and they had actually previewed some of the songs, and that was pretty cool. My wife and I drove all the way, like almost a 4-hour drive to Nashville, Tennessee to see him. And it was wonderful. I hope I get to see him again. It was a great experience, but he usually changes his band up on every tour also. He likes to use different groups of instruments. He'll bring along violin players, assorted jazz musicians, or he'll go, like I said, with the basic rock combo. He likes to shake it up and make sure that he's not bored and the audience is not bored. And I really appreciate that in an artist. So as much as people cry for him to go back and do what you used to do, Joe, I say, Joe, do what you want to do. I'll be there to listen to it, and eventually I'll probably get it and love it. All right. Hey.
Awesome. All right, and then we'll edit it here. So we'll come back from Bill. Bill has given a great Joe Jackson overview. And
I like Joe. That's all I have to say.
All right, thanks, Bill. That was great. Appreciate it. We're gonna keep rolling and go right over to Bicycle Legs. So Bicycle Legs, why don't you let us know what you think about Joe Jackson?
Oh, look, I'm a huge Joe Jackson fan. Have been since the sort of early 80s. I mean, I probably came in where a lot of people came in with the Night and Day album. But I mean, he goes all the way back. He starts off sort of in the post-punk era, sort of new wave with the Look Sharp and I'm the Man, and then Beat Crazy. Beat Crazy is an interesting album of the three because it's the one that was by far the least popular. It didn't have a big hit on it. And it's a very dark album lyrically. I don't know what Joe was going through at the time, but there's some really sort of dark topics like political and sexual and that sort of thing on that album. So I find that one quite fascinating. He had like the Joe Jackson band for those first three albums. And then he broke the Joe Jackson band up and went in a completely different direction and did Joe Jackson's Jump and Jive, where he did an album of jump blues and big band covers. Like before it was popular, that sort of thing sort of had a revival in the 90s. And he was doing this in like 1981, which I find fascinating. Then, of course, you had Night and Day. Night and Day was the huge album worldwide. He had his big hit, Stepping Out. Funnily enough, here in Australia, the big hit was Real Man.
Nice.
Which wasn't really a hit anywhere else. But it was a top 10 hit here in Australia. And again, Joe Jackson was very ahead of his time lyrically, because if you look at the song Real Man, in 1982, he's writing a song which is basically about toxic masculinity. Before that term even really existed. Going back to the Beat Crazy album, I mean, you look at a song like Fit. That song, the first verse of that song is about trans people. You know? And he says, don't laugh, but there are people in this world born as boys and fighting to be girls, you know? And then the second verse of that song, of course, is obviously about mixed race people. You know, he was really ahead of his time with a lot of this sort of social commentary, which I think a lot of people forget. One of my personal favorite Joe Jackson albums is this one, Body and Soul. It's one of the most incredibly beautifully recorded albums, mostly recorded live with just a few overdubs and recorded in an old stone church. I don't remember exactly which church it was. It was somewhere in New York City. But the sound he gets on this album is just incredible. It's one of the best produced albums I think I've ever heard. And he's definitely going into that sort of very soulful sound with Night and Day and Body and Soul. You know, there's a lot of sort of Latin rhythms and that sort of thing. I mean, just one of the things about Joe Jackson generally is I don't know very many musicians. Sorry, trying to hold my phone at the same time as talk. I don't know that many musicians who have covered as much musical ground in their careers as Joe Jackson has. I mean, he started off with sort of new wave post-punk, and then he does jump blues, and then he does sort of soulful Latin influenced music. And then Big World is another album I really, really like. That one is recorded completely live in front of an audience, but the audience were requested to keep quiet so that it sounded like a studio album. You know, it's sort of more of a rock album, a singer-songwritery kind of album. Then I think I did see Bill briefly talking about that one, Willpower, which is his classical album. You know, I mean, that's the thing too about Joe Jackson. He's a classically trained musician. He went to the Royal Academy of Music in London. And, you know, when he writes orchestral works, he orchestrates them himself. You know, he doesn't, you know, get an orchestrator in like a lot of musicians who dabble in the orchestral or, classical world will often write the themes and then get someone to orchestrate it for them. He does his own orchestrations, which I think is quite incredible. There's the great live album from various different, sort of from 1983 to 1986, includes 3 very different arrangements of Is She Really Going Out With Him, which of course was his first big hit in the UK. This is one of my personal favourites, Blaze of Glory. It's a concept album. And like all the tracks run together. And I've always really enjoyed that album. Again, more of a rock feel. Some people call it almost an arena rock album. I don't know if I'd quite go that far, but it's definitely a rock and roll album. And then he does a very sort of showing he still has the pop chops with Laughter and Lust. That one's a bit of a spotty album for me, if I'm being honest. There's some great songs on it, and there's a wonderful cover of Oh Well. But there's also, I think it's a little bit overlong, that album, for me. The next album really is special to me personally, and that is Night Music. It's a very delicate album. Again, he's going more for his sort of classical thing, but it has some of the songs have lyrics. This album's very personal for me because it's the album I listened to driving home from the hospital after my father had passed away. And it just seemed sort of appropriate music for that very sort of solemn moment. Like, it wasn't a surprise. We knew my dad was going, but it was still very sad when he left us. And I always think of my dad when I listen to that album. And then this one's a personal favorite of mine. Where is it? Heaven and Hell. I adore this album. Concept album about the 7 deadly sins. He has guest artists like Brad Roberts from the Crash Test Dummies and Suzanne Vega doing some of the vocals. I've always thought that was one of his most successful concept albums. Really, really like that one. Night and Day Part 2. Yeah, I mean, when I'm in the mood for that album, it really, really hits the spot, but I have to be in the mood for that one. It does have a very sort of electronic, dancey kind of feel to it. Going back to the sort of salsa feel as well, but with a much more electronic thing going to it. It's interesting to hear him sort of reflecting on New York 20 years after he moved there, whereas the original Night and Day is sort of his first impressions of New York, as it were. He's definitely a lot more cynical about New York 20 years on when he's writing the songs for Night and Day too. And then he puts the Joe Jackson Band back together for Volume 4, which it's an interesting concept, that one, because he puts the band back together, but he doesn't go exactly back to the old sound, except for a couple of songs toward the end of it. There are a couple of songs at the end of this where he's definitely striving for that original Joe Jackson Band sound, with songs like Thugs Are Us and Bright Grey. They definitely remind me of sort of late 70s Joe Jackson Band stuff. But the rest of it sounds more like sort of what he's done ever since, really. Rain is a great album, I think, just the trio of piano, bass, drums. Some of his best songwriting in his latter years, I think. So, yeah, I mean, and then his last few albums have been really good. Although, look, The Duke was an interesting concept, but I don't think it quite worked for me. trying to modernize Duke Ellington music. I'm not sure that really, some of it works, some of it doesn't. But the last couple of albums, Fast Forward and Fool, I think are wonderful. You know, again, sort of in that more singer-songwritery kind of mode. Oh, and I forgot to mention Symphony Number 1 from 1999. Joe Jackson goes prog. I mean, this really is. I mean, you know, he's writing a symphony, but he's doing it with, you know, electric instrument, with rock instruments as well as horns and a violin. It really comes off as a sort of a big, long instrumental prog suite. So, I mean, that's Joe Jackson. I can understand why a lot of people don't sort of like the whole catalogue, simply because he goes so far over the musical map. He does everything. There's really not an awful lot he hasn't done, except maybe heavy metal. But, you know, I mean, even on those early albums, there's a couple of songs that are really punky, like the song I'm a Man. That's a punk song. You know, I mean, not lyrically, but musically, it's very aggressive and punky. So, but I love the fact that Joe Jackson goes all over the musical map. It really, I always love, I have a disc in the car where I have all of his albums up to and including Rain, because I can't fit any more on one disc. And it's just a journey to go through that whole disc when I'm driving in the car. So yeah, that's Joe Jackson. I mean, just a man of many, many talents. What more can I say?
Awesome. Well, thanks, Bicycle Legs. I hope a little bit more, because I have a couple questions. So, like I said,
yeah, sure.
I hadn't really heard of Joe Jackson before this. So, when I was doing a little bit of research, I put on a few songs. So, you know, Stepping Out and a couple other songs, and I think it was It's Different for Girls.
Oh yeah.
Is that what it's called?
In the UK.
Yeah. So that song, I was sort of surprised, because it sounds, to me at least, it sounded like something I would have expected, you know, to come 20 years late, like after it was written. So I guess my question is do you hear, how should I phrase this? Do you think he's one of those sort of unmentioned influences that you can see his influence on a lot of maybe more popular acts or you know, hit songs, things like that? Do you think that he's had more of an influence than maybe someone like myself would be able to appreciate, because it didn't know about him, didn't know where these things were coming from? Or do you think that he's largely just been ignored by the mainstream since he had those hits? Because it doesn't look like he's really, you know, been a sort of a mainstream success ever since Stepping Out. But, you know, would you care to elaborate? Maybe anyone got a response to that?
I would say, I'd say you hit it with the he's mostly been ignored since then, other than by the hardcore fans. Like, I can't, as much as I would like to say otherwise, I don't think he's had a major influence upon the overall popular music scene since his heyday in the 80s. I'm sure there are some artists who have been influenced by him, but I don't think it's anything overt that I'm aware of. I'd be curious if if anybody knows any, I'd be curious to check those artists out. And
I wouldn't know any specific artist, but I do think he's the sort of act who is a musician's musician, where I think other musicians definitely do listen to him. There's, you know, he's done, I know XTC were fans of his. And when they did the XTC tribute album, Testimonial Dinner, Joe Jackson did a cover of Statue of Liberty, which is really, really good. But yeah, I think his influence on other musicians is probably subtle. I think because he doesn't have a specific style that other musicians can, say, copy or borrow off, I think that makes it a little more difficult. But I think subtly, it's certainly other musicians really, really respect Joe Jackson. So yeah, I wouldn't say he's an overt influence, but but I think it's there bubbling under.
I would agree. I'm sorry. God.
Oh, no. Please.
The fact that he has had so many well-known musicians, like I mentioned, Steve Vai earlier, had mentioned, Christian McBride and Regina. Sorry, my brain is lapsing here. Modern jazz violinist. She's awesome. I can't even think of her last name now. But at any rate, he's had a number of very well-known musicians in their field. So anybody that can attract that caliber of musician, there must be something there.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I don't know. I as I said, I wasn't here to sort of hear what Bill was talking about, but just as a bit of a tangent, can we talk about the great Graham Mabey?
Oh, absolutely. I had meant to do that. So, yeah.
I mean, Graham Mabey's been Joe Jackson's bassist for most of his career, and he's one of the unsung great bass players of all time, as far as I'm concerned. So, yeah, just want to give a shout out to Graham Mabey there. While he's been an integral part of Joe Jackson's career right from the beginning up until now. He's still in Joe Jackson's touring band to this day.
Okay.
All right. So I guess where would you say, because it sounds like he's got a very eclectic and sort of a wide range of sounds. Where do you think is the best place to start off your Joe Jackson journey?
One album, perhaps. If I were to pick a single album, I'd go for Big World from 1986. It has 15 songs. It has a variety of styles on it. Lots of catchy tracks. If you don't like anything you hear on Big World, you're probably not going to like Joe Jackson. Would you agree, Bicyclelegs, that this is a good
Yeah, that's probably it's probably not a bad place to start. It's probably not the first one I would have thought of, but you're right. It does cover a lot of, like, it has the album's three-sided on vinyl, so the fourth side is blank, and it really does kind of have a bit of a flow to it. Like, each side has a different flavor of Joe Jackson, as it were. Sort of the first side is the more standard, straight up sort of songs. The second side is the sort of more quiet songs, the mellow songs, the reflective and thoughtful songs. And then the third side is the really up-tempo Joe Jackson. So yeah, I mean, that's probably a really good place to start, actually. I think it does depend on sort of what you're wanting to get out of Joe Jackson.
True.
Sometimes I think it's, with an artist like Joe Jackson, you're better off starting at the beginning and just working your way through. So, you know, those first couple of albums, Look Sharp and I'm the Man, are a good place to start too, especially if you are from a more harder edge kind of music, because there is definitely a new wave post-punk kind of sound to a lot of the songs on that. Bit of a reggae influence as well. If you're into pop Joe Jackson, I think Night and Day and the one that Body and Soul are really good albums to start with. As I say, I think where you start with Joe Jackson depends on where you're starting from in your own musical journey, about what you sort of listen to. If you're into sort of more classical influenced or progressive kind of stuff, then I would probably go with something like Heaven and Hell.
Okay.
So,
sorry. Please go, Bill.
I thought of something earlier talking about bands that may have been influenced, and I just remembered, I believe it was Anthrax that covered Got the Time from the debut back in the 80s. So there you go. That's that's a statement all by itself.
All right. So I obviously, you know, Contrarians mostly heavy metal and hard rock. So I'm going to put a bit of a tougher question to you guys. How would you, what is the olive branch that you would use to say, to get someone who likes who's purely heavy metal and hard rock, and this doesn't like anything that doesn't have that edge. Why should they give Joe Jackson a chance? What would be that all branch that you would use to get them over there? Whatever it is, or however far fetched it might be. Maybe that's an impossible task, but I'm going to ask anyway. So, Bill, what would you say?
I'm not sure I have a good answer for that. If they don't really like anything beyond hard rock and metal, I'm not sure Joe's going to be the one to bring them out of that bubble, honestly. I'd like to say otherwise, but
no, I think that's fair. I mean, if you're going to pick a couple of tracks for a hard rock and metal person to go for, then Got the Time is good, because, I mean, Anthrax covered that song for a reason, because it does have a real sort of fast, hard edge kind of thing to it. And then the other song, as I said earlier, I'm the Man. And they're both on they're both on the first two albums. Got the Time is on Look Sharp, and I'm the Man is obviously the title track of I'm the Man. So those are probably the sweeteners that I would offer. But if you're purely a hard rock and metal person, as Bill said, Joe Jackson's probably not going to be for you. Although he's got a couple of songs that have that harder edge, it's really not his wheelhouse. So, as I said, he's covered so many different areas, but metal's probably the one thing he hasn't done. So,
all right. Well, I guess today's episode is Contrarians, because we're going contrarian and saying, hey, if you only like hard rock and heavy metal, Joe Jackson maybe not a good recommendation. But if you have an appreciation for, stuff that's a little more, what's the word we should use? Little bit of a softer edge to it, maybe a lot of a softer edge. There's two really good arguments and overviews for why Joe Jackson is great. I'm going to say I'm personally convinced. I liked what I listened to, and I took down some recommendations here for starting points from Bill and bicyclelegs. So thank you very much, guys. Yeah, I guess if we didn't really do introductions at the start, so why don't we go around and we can each give a sort of final statement and maybe let the folks at home know a little bit about you. So here, let's start with bicyclelegs. Bicyclelegs, final word for the audience?
Yeah. Look, I think just with Joe Jackson, if you want an artist who can pretty much do it all, Joe Jackson is the man. He says, I'm the man, and he is the man when it comes to, sort of wandering all over the musical map. If you want to find me, I'm bicyclelegs here on YouTube, also on Instagram and Twitter. My most recent episode, I just did an In Defense Of episode where I defended the John Payne era of Asia, where I actually argued that some of the best music Asia ever made was in the much sort of ignored and maligned John Payne era rather than the John Wetton era. And so come and have a look. I've got a bunch of videos up on my channel, and yeah, everybody's welcome.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being here, bicyclelegs. Always appreciated. Bill, final message for the folks at home?
I'd say bicyclelegs pretty well covered it. Joe is he's all over the map. If you don't want to be bored by an artist, if you're the kind of person that likes to explore an artist's career from start to finish, it's an entertaining ride. If you get into Joe, you're going to take a lot of twists and turns, go down some caves, climb some mountains, drop into some gullies, and wonder what just happened here. But it's never boring. Very rarely, anyway. So buckle up, everybody. Jump on board the Joe Jackson train. It's worth your time.
Awesome. Well, I can't think of a better closing statement than that. That was great. So we'll just say thanks to our panelists for being here. Thanks to you at home for watching. I know this is a little different than our normal genre, but hey, we're stretching and trying new things. So hope you liked it. If you did, like and subscribe, share with your friends. Let us know what you think in the comments. But thanks so much for watching. And if you're in the morning, have a great morning. If you're at night, have a great night. And otherwise, have a great day. Thanks, everyone.